Our speaker today is Mrs. Gwyneth Wykes of York, Maine. She will be presenting her story of how she, as a 12-year-old girl, survived the bombing of Coventry in England during the early days of World War II. Mrs. Wykes, who presented her story to veterans in York, Maine 2 weeks ago, has spoken extensively on this topic in public forums and in many schools. She has a diverse background, which includes being a commentator and a writer for an international magazine, a professional model, and an actor who portrays Queen Elizabeth I in an annual Shakespearean festival. It is a pleasure to welcome Mrs. Gwyneth Wykes.
Hear me? As I said, this is a very special day today, and when Warren called me, wrote to me about coming, it was my pleasure to say yes. I would like to take a moment just to say you have my heartfelt gratitude, all you veterans that are here, because without your intervention coming over to England and helping us to win the war, I certainly would not be here. So thank you again from my heart. I'm so pleased to be here to talk to you. As Dorothy mentioned, I was born in Coventry and raised there, and I was 12 years old. And when, maybe I should tell you about the city first. Those of you who have been there already know the story, but this is the most incredible city, and the way it rose from the ashes is also monumental also. The city was started in 500 as a nunnery, and by the other spectrum in the 1930s, the city on the perimeter was ringed with machine tool factories, car factories, airplane factories, ribbon factories that started in the 1600s, just an amazing perimeter to the city. As you came closer into the center, there were the old factories there. The first sewing machine was made there, invented and made there. The first bicycle. This, of course, then made it so that the cars then were invented also. Every car that was made in England was made in the Coventry area, but one. Rolls-Royce, Daimler, Aston Martins, Humber Hillmans, all the cars you can think of were made there. Then as you came in closer to the city, the electrical factories were there, 1930s, 1940s. As you came into the center, we had the most incredible medieval center. Started with the nunnery that I mentioned in 500. In 1200, it became a monastery, and the small animals, sheep, ducks, pheasants were the order of the day. 13th, 14th, 15th centuries is when the city became alive. The churches were built. The center of the city housed two churches and one that became a cathedral. Those spires dominated the skyline as you looked at Coventry, and it became known as the city of three spires. It still is, and amazingly, with all the bombing, those three steeples remained in the sky that you could see, just almost like a vision of what the city was after it was bombed. And then the war was being talked about. In the 1935, the conversation was about the war starting. And so sometimes the machine tool factories listed news in the newspaper that they were making machine tools just in case there was a war. And then, of course, our Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, said in a speech in September, when he declared that it was going to be a war, that he had tried everything with Hitler, and there was nothing he found he could say or do which could change the course, and that the war would have to go forward. And this is what he said. His voice I was with my grandparents at their home 10 miles from the city centre. I was actually born in their house, so the house was very precious to me. I was an only child, and that weekend I was to spend it with them. My grandmother put 2 chairs in front of the radio to listen to the Prime Minister's speech, which was to be at 11 o'clock. My grandfather left to go to the local inn to be with the village elders to listen to the speech there. We sat at the 2 chairs and we listened to his speech. And as a 12-year-old, I remember now that I thought his voice sounded so tired and frustrated. He sounded sick at heart that he had to announce that we were going to be at war. He made a lengthy speech, and then at the end he said, microphone here. I'll never forget how he finished it. He said, "God bless us all. We shall be fighting against brute force, bad faith, injustice, oppression and persecution, and I am certain we shall prevail." You know, as a 12-year-old, I remember thinking how defeated he sounded. So I said to my grandmother, "What will happen now?" She said, "Life will never, ever be the same." And that's all she had to say. My parents came for me that night, drove me back to Coventry. School the next morning, we started at 8:45. We started changing shoes, and we had rubber sole shoes to wear, called ward shoes. Some of you who were in my age group might remember those days of school. Rainy weather, we wore Wellington boots, of course, so we changed into those rubber sole shoes. And then there was no conversation very much. The teachers had us go to assembly at 9 o'clock. The headmistress or principal was there, very grim-faced. All of the students were there, about 120 of us. She started not with the prayer, she started with the announcement, "We are at war. You must listen carefully, you must obey our precautionary methods. They will be given to you in about a week's time." And then we had the prayer and we were dismissed. The next day, I, from home, went to school, another assembly. Already there were lists of instructions. And each day in the mail at home, letters came. We had 2 deliveries a day, one in the morning and one at 2 in the afternoon. And all the instructions started to come within 10 days of how we were to respond to these precautionary measures. I must tell you that as a 12-year-old, I listened to the declaration of war and I felt sad. But when I got home and I thought about it, I thought everything I had read about declarations of war in England meant that our troops, our military, would go off to France or to Germany or wherever. Thank you, that's very thoughtful.
What time frame is it? Is
Sorry?
it 1938 or 39?
1939.
39.
Yes, and so that was what I thought. I went to bed that night thinking our men will be going abroad. It never, honestly, never occurred to me that we were going to be the target and that we might be invaded, we might be bombed. None of those things occurred to me, but in the next 10 days, it was a reality check, because every mail that came to the house came with discussions, instructions. So every night after dinner, my mother opened the mail and there would be instructions from the council house. We have to remember, most of you will remember, that we didn't have telephones then. 80% of the whole of the city did not have a communication source other than the mail. The printers, my mother commented on this, she said they must be working 24 hours a day. On every wall, on every church bulletin board, cafes, restaurants, there were these enormous posters giving us instructions of how to, when to, and where to go to collect ration cards, identity cards, and everything else that was going to help us survive. Eventually, when you had registered for those things, the ration cards came, the identity cards came, and then we knew exactly how much food we were going to get. And those of you who've had parents in Coventry would remember this. The ration cards were 28 pages long, and don't forget we had been used to the little butcher shop and the little grocery shop and the greengrocer. Now we had these ration cards. We pretty much had to go to the same places. We couldn't shop around for our groceries. List of allowances for food: bacon and ham, 4 ounces, sugar, 8 ounces, meat, 5 ounces. Think of that, a hamburger patty for a week. Tea, 2 ounces. My mother thought that was abusive. She really did. So she talked to people who didn't like tea as much as she did. She thought it was life's blood. Cheese, 4 ounces, jam, 8 ounces, fat or lard for cooking, 6 ounces, butter, 2 ounces. Rationing was still on in England when I came to Canada in '51. The first thing I did was buy 2 pounds of butter. Because not having butter, candy, if any, and believe me, there wasn't any, 1 fresh egg per week, if available. Can you imagine how many people bought chickens and they raised their own? Because the idea of that's protein, you know. The thing that saved us, I think, and kept us healthy was that we were an island and we could have fish. We ate fish every way, shape and form. I grew up on fish. And I think you would be hard-pressed to have found anybody who was overweight during those war years, because the food was so limited. We had all the gardening areas, especially in the city areas, the gardens were very small. So any green area that could be leased or borrowed, people would put in a vegetable garden, and those areas were called allotments, and people grew their own vegetables, masses and masses of vegetables, and this way it helped us survive. I think back to school, the school that I went to was an all-girls school. It had started off by being a beautiful old house, not as big as a stately home, but quite a large home, built by a local manufacturer who had made a lot of money in the early 1900s, in a beautiful residential area about a mile from my home. It was called Stoke Park. And then in 1919, my school organization bought it. It was called Stoke Park for girls. Very, very strict. You'll smile when I tell you what the creed was. No young woman should make a nuisance of herself. My husband said, "What happened?" But I can assure you that being so closely disciplined helped a great deal when we were in a position where we were faced with being in the shelters for hours. There was no thought of being misbehaved, making a lot of noise. The house was beautiful, a turreted roof and so on. We were about 120 students, and to a class about 20 of us, 5 in a row. The desks were anchored to the floor. You know how the old sewing machines used to be with the wrought iron? You know, you banged your knee when you got in and you banged your knee when you got out. We wore uniform. So the drill was, they had cellars under the school where they had put benches. And so they practiced before the sirens were actually established. Somebody made a noise. We stood up at the side of our desks. The end row would go first, the second row, the third, the fourth of the 20 girls, out into the hall. You were told to walk swiftly, smartly, and silently, not a sound. And out into the hall, 120 of us would walk quickly, right down to the stairs, down into the cellar under the school, and there was room for all of us if we sat very close together. And those rubber sole shoes and the rustle of those wool skirts is something I hear sometimes in at night. It was so quick and yet so quiet, so urgent. And then down in the shelter we sat, nobody spoke until the teacher spoke to you. It was incredible because I think we had a feeling we had no idea what might happen. Those were the practice sessions. So then eventually gas masks were on the order of the day, and they were about 3 weeks into the start of the war. So they announced at school that we should go prepared to be outside for a couple of hours or so. There we were, all 120 of us, and we had a gas chamber that was brought onto the property, housed in what would look to all of us, I think, like a Winnebago, like a house trailer. There were 4 attendants in dark blue uniforms, I can see them now, and we were taken into this chamber 2 by 2, and with the gas mask on, we were fitted. My hair, it's thick now, but in those days, hairdressers didn't thin your hair, they just cut it. So my hair literally was out here, a real mop of red hair. They looked at me, and I suppose they assumed my head was much larger than it was because of this enormous amount of hair. They gave me a gas mask, sent me into the gas chamber, and I nearly died. I thought I had never experienced such pain, such stinging. I threw up my hands, I couldn't speak, it was so bad. And they discovered that because of the hair, it pulled the rubber away from my face. So I literally did have a dose of gas. So I took me out to the garden, they got wet rags and mopped my face and so on. I was speechless, absolutely speechless. And I think what was in the back of my mind was the fact that we lost a family member to gassing. My father's oldest brother in World War I was over in France. He was gassed. He came home to die an incredibly painful death, which took 5 months. And I'm thinking in that gas chamber, this was happening to me. It really left an enormously bad impression. They gave me another gas mask about 20 minutes later. In I had to go. You can only imagine what that was like for me. And then the thoughts that I had, I have to say, as a child, you're thinking, how is it possible that someone could drop gas on us and have us die? Bombs are one thing, but I think gassing a whole part, and literally that was what I thought of most during the worst of the bombing. So anyway, gas masks in cardboard boxes which went everywhere with you. My mother, to make it easier, managed to get some Roundtree's wine gums. English people know what they are, a little tube, and I was forbidden to eat any unless a bomb actually hit the shelter, I was told. So I often used to steal 1 or 2. But anyway, so that was the getting ready for the bombing and the school. At home, we went shopping. There were lines everywhere at the ironmonger store, which we call hardware stores here, for black cloth to make black draperies to cover the windows, yellow tape, which was for masking the windows. They were done in diamond-shaped crisscross like this over every window in the house. Most English homes have very heavy drapes anyway, but these were not sufficient, the authorities felt, to keep out any light that might show and have the bombers have a target. So the black material, seamstresses were busy through many, many nights, I'm sure, getting every house equipped with these black curtains. So they were lines to get those things. Up and down the roads, everywhere you went, there were step ladders and ladders. Have you ever experienced when you're at a country fair and the village alongside it is busy, busy, everybody with tasks for one occasion, for a fair? Imagine that 1,000-fold in a city where everybody is getting ready for the bombing experience. That's the way it was. As a child, I just could not believe it. Life became so busy, all getting ready for what they feared might happen. And then on the streets, all street lights were completely turned off. No street lights were on at all, which made negotiating on a dark night very hazardous, especially with those cast iron mailboxes on almost every street corner. I can't tell you the emergency rooms, how many hundreds of people, broken noses, broken chins, teeth knocked out, people out at night, and flashlights they discouraged so that you would walk along and pitch darkness. I don't know what it is about an English night that is so much darker than any American night I've ever been. It's probably the cloud cover, as you well know. Someone once said, England is a great country, it rains a lot, and they forgot to put the roof on. And I think that's just about the way it was. The cars had half a mask on the headlights, half, so that only half of the headlight showed. That was hazardous to cross the road. Bicycles the same way. Half the light was masked. The mailboxes I've mentioned, innumerable accidents. Due to the darkened streets, the buses also, those 2-decker buses you see, no lights inside at all. You felt your way up the stairs to go upstairs, no lights at all. And that was your only means of transportation, obviously. The other thing about the double-decker buses affected me. I never have been able to swim. I don't know why, but I've never have been able to swim. On street corners throughout the city, every spare green area that didn't have trees on it was confiscated by the authorities, and it was excavated to have water, reservoirs in it for in case we needed the water for putting out the fires. So as you came down a street in a double-decker bus, if you were on the upper deck, you know, I'm still amazed how far those buses lean over as they go around a corner. If you were on, I always made sure I was on the lower deck, because if you've had that experience looking down into a couple of 1,000 gallons of water and the bus is going around the corner, that's something else I remember very well, a painful experience. So I told you about the notices. The next thing that was an important addition to our home, my father, who was an engineer, he qualified with the Daimler company, a wonderful car company. You must know Queen drives a Daimler. My husband was very proud of being a Daimler engineer. He joined the Hawker Siddeley Aircraft Company to help with the aircraft. And he became accomplished enough that he formed a crew, and then he was never home with us, very rarely home with us, because he was traveling England and Wales to air bases, repairing aircraft that came in that were already damaged, getting them ready to go back and do some more flying for the war. So he wasn't home very much. But he decided that we should have an Anderson shelter in the garden. Our gardens were very small in the front because it was you know, a residential area near a city and close to the factories. The back was a small area too. Many people decided not to put on their own Anderson shelters, and they didn't want to spoil their gardens. However, he decided we would have one. So 2 men came. They dug down 4 feet. It was 6 feet wide and 12 feet long. The whole of the lawn practically was taken up. I quite happily watched them do this. My father went in. The corrugated sheets were put on the side and on the roof, and the soil that was dug out went on top of the Anderson shelter. A small opening like this with 3 steps down into this hole in the ground. I helped take a camp cot down, sleeping bags, a shelf, some tin food with some can openers, just to make it comfortable, some pillows. You couldn't leave things out, it was too damp. And that was to be our place to go if we were bombed. On many of the parks in Coventry, I think there were about 60 parks throughout the city of Coventry. They were excavated also in clear areas. Some would take 300 people, some would take 100 people. The one that was 200 yards from my house could take 100 people. So most of the people in my area went there. So the first night that we did have a raid, my mother had put everything ready. We went out through the back door, went down into the shelter, and there the two of us sat. And we had 26, what do you call them, artillery bases around the city. The big guns were there to fire at the planes. Everything that they shot up into the sky had to come down if it didn't hit anything. So there were 26 anti-aircraft emplacements all around the city. One of them was in 2 miles of our house. The first night that we had a siren and a few planes went over, all the shrapnel from the guns was coming down on this roof above the shelter. And my mother said, "There's no way we can stay here. We're going to go to the big shelter." So all that work was for naught because really just the two of us. The shrapnel from the guns caused many, many injuries too. My father had a tin helmet. He had one incredible indentation in the tin helmet from shrapnel from the guns. I have to say they never shot down one plane all throughout the war, which was the caricatures in the newspaper. People with a sense of humor, even in that time of war, made great fun of the fact that they were shooting away, for almost a year, but never shot anything down. And the shrapnel did cause so many problems. But the shelter at 200 yards from the house, on the way to it, going down our road, they built temporary shelters that were about the size of a single-car garage, exactly about the size of a single-car garage, with concrete blocks and then this corrugated roof, so that if you were caught between the house and the shelter, you could duck into this little shelter and a couple of wooden benches, and sometimes we were caught like that. And so we would duck in there, wait till the bomb sounded as though they were finished and out, and then we would run down to the main shelter. And so that was the plan. And as the intensity of the raids continued, we spent more and more time running down to the shelter. My mother had a box, a metal box with securities in it. And she had her fur coat, which was a precious possession in those days. She was 5'1" tall, and I had a heavy coat on the bed, my Wellington boots beside it. I used to rehearse running down the chairs from the bedroom. The staircase had a bend in it like this. I practiced in the daylight because we had no lights at all. I could do 3 stairs at a time without breaking my neck. And I was so proud of this. I could get out of bed, into the Wellington boots, the heavy coat, and down into the hallway. So I said to her one day, "Why do you bother with this metal box? It's so heavy." She said, "Chilled you." She said, "This is so that they will know who we are if we can't speak for ourselves." She said, "And they have all the family connections in there, so that they can let our family know should we not survive." Imagine. But she was the most cheerful person. Anyway, I mentioned what the government took over also, which made a real impression on me. And I think maybe you can relate to it, having grown up in Coventry too. One day I went to school. My garden gate was there, wrought iron gate and wrought iron railings. Came home from school, the gate was gone, the railings were gone, and we got a letter which had was late in the mail apparently, advising us that the government were going to come and take all wrought iron furniture, all gates, all railings from all the properties. Almost every house on our road had wrought iron gates. You can't imagine what it looked like. To me, it looked like a blind person, every garden, with just an opening where the gate had been. And also, a little light touch for me was that dogs, everybody had a dog in the neighborhood. English people are famous for their love of dogs. And all the dogs on our road, which was probably 100 yards long, had been used to having a gate there. And I would come out and go to school, and I'd pass a dog who was sitting where the gate used to be, wondering, should I go out or should I stay here? And as I would proceed along, maybe not going to school and didn't have a deadline, I would see Mrs. Reed's precious Pomeranian wandering out into the road, somebody else's German Shepherd also, but the dogs were absolutely mixed up. They had no idea. They were so used to being in or out on a lead. That was I would take Mrs. Reed's Pomeranian back and the German Shepherd. And one story that always made me smile, have you all seen that sitcom from England called Hyacinth, where she goes to see her sister and the dog is in the car? We had one house on our corner, Armstrong Avenue, where they had an enormous German Shepherd with lots of hair. And the gate was this high, but he was so tall, he could, as you came around the corner, he would leap to the gate, whoosh, like this. And people, when the gates were gone, they would cross the road anyway, rather than not walk past, you know. So those were things so far as the road was concerned. And as I told you about the food, public shelters, I think the shelters, you'll see in the footage I have to show you some of the people who were interviewed later in life about their experiences in the shelters. I was so fortunate. Our neighborhood was an ultra-conservative English road to the T. Next door to the lady next door, I'd been there since I was born. I had never been in her house. She would say, "Good morning, Gwyneth." I would say, "Good morning, Mrs. Davis," and so on all the way down the road. But nobody mixed. Nobody came into each other's house for coffee. The war changed that. It did wonderful things to change that. That shelter of 100 people was amazing to me. Those people got up in the middle of the night. I just explained to you a couple of people. One man was called Mr. Reed. I never saw that man smile in all the years, my 12 years, 13 years. He would pass you by, "Morning, Gwyneth," have the dog. And Mrs. Smith down the road was always beautifully coiffed, you know, the hair just so. Both of those characters, middle of the night, Mrs. Smith, cold cream, hair in rollers. He was there with blue striped pajamas, a heavy coat, still as serious looking. And then after the third week, where we had been up many, many nights going to the shop, he arrived with his banjo, Mr. Reed, and he played. Some people came with mouth organs, some people came with guitars, and they left them in the shelter. It was a complete metamorphosis of people's characters. Amazingly, when it was all over, they went back to being surly Mr. Reed and Mrs. Smith. But it did wonders. And for me, as being 12 years old, going to that shelter was wonderful, because I went down, it was more spacious, I didn't feel as closed in. When the bombs went off, it was boom, like this. People didn't cower. I never saw anyone cry, never saw anybody complain. And when the fire wardens came to the shelter door to say we could come out, nobody pushed. Everybody help the infirm first to come out. It was just the most incredible change. And for me, it made all the difference. I really didn't mind going to the shelter, and the claustrophobia sort of went away. The one that was another 200 yards away, that would take 300 people, you will see one lady who was in there. They never could fix the water situation, and that there were about 4 to 6 inches of water in that shelter at all times. People wore Wellington boots, but they sat with their feet in the water, and buckets for the sanitary, you will hear her explain. So we were very, very fortunate to have that situation. And I think at school it worked out very well. Finally, after the major raid, it was decided that I should go to my grandparents' home to stay. But the saddest stories, I think, came from the city decided that the children should be evacuated, and they put out letters in the newspaper that it was only right that people should send their children away to be evacuated. Well, you can imagine if you had small children, how difficult that would be to send them away, because they had no idea who they were going to, what kind of a home they were going to. The government arranged in the churches and the meeting halls, council houses in the north, where it was considered to be safe. There weren't probably not going to be any bombing up there. People put their names down to foster children. And so the people who decided, hundreds and hundreds of children were evacuated. 1 in 5, the statistics showed, were actually evacuated from the city, and the buses would take them. And this is the kind of thing the newspaper said. Parents are asked particularly to notice following instructions, that the arrangements, buses were going to pick them up, and it says where, take their ration cards and gas masks. Children should of course take warm clothing with them, and if possible a strong pair of boots, a pair of Wellingtons, change of underwear, it says. So 1 in 5 children. Some of the memoirs I've read of people who were evacuated, I felt so fortunate to be able to go to my grandparents' home for the short period. Some of those children, one girl I read, she was 7 years old. Her sister was 9. They were evacuated. They got to this northern town with a busload of children. They were taken to a drop-off point at a church. The people who were going to foster them came at different times during the day and picked out the children that they would like to have. Consequently, it's how you looked. This girl said, 7 years old, she was there with her sister, hoping and praying that they would find a home together. And someone came, took her sister, but she was left there alone. She was 7 years old. The whole room was emptied except for this little girl. And she writes that a couple finally came at 7:30 at night. They had been working, and they looked around and they took her. And she said to this day, she remembers that her sister was chosen. She said she was much prettier than I was. And so there were a lot of broken hearts. In Roger Moore, I met him once, and he said, he wrote in his memoir also, he said he was the son of a policeman, and his father and mother decided in the outer London area that he should be evacuated. Where he was sent, he said he was treated so poorly, the food was so terrible, and the conditions so unbearable, at least they were to him, that he wrote to his father and said, I'm going to walk home if you don't come and get me. So his father went, picked him up, and eventually found a farm that he could go to. He said he had the most wonderful time with that family, and he said she made incredible gravy. He said, and for the rest of my life, even if I'm making a movie in some foreign country, whoever's coming from England, please bring me some gravy. He said from that home it made all the difference. But can you imagine how many children were in that position? Imagine the ones who were evacuated to Canada, thousands of miles from where their parents were. And and yet I have other friends, a couple of friends who were evacuated to homes where to the day they died, they were like family to them. They were treated so beautifully. So I think the night of the Blitz was probably the worst of all. We went to the shelter, the big one I mentioned to you. There was no music. The bombing started at about 7 o'clock in the evening, and statistics showed that there were 400 bombers which crisscrossed the city this way and then this way about every half an hour for 13 hours. And the damage, the deaths, it was the most incredible, inhumane act, they say, has ever been achieved in war history. And I have a list of what happened in that night. I remember nobody screamed, nobody cried. Everybody just cowered, it seemed to me, close to each other like this. And they just felt, statistics show 373 raids in the whole of from 1940 to 42. That's 2 years. 41, they actually were bombing raids where bombs were dropped and there was damage and lives were lost. There were 75,000 homes at that time in Coventry. 5,500 were completely destroyed and 50,700 were damaged. 624 stores and shops were lost or damaged, unusable. 73 industrial premises, 84 warehouses, gas mains, electric mains, water mains, all totally destroyed. And the worst part about that was that the building where all the maps were for those three entities was destroyed. So none of the technicians who might have been able to refit those situations and help in that emergency were not able to. 28 hotels destroyed, 14 theaters and cinemas. Amazing story. Next to my dancing school was a theater called the Rex Theater. It had just been finished, red velvet seats, extraordinarily beautiful the way the theaters used to be, and placards everywhere on billboards and on the radio. The Rex Theater was going to have the movie Gone with the Wind, Margaret Mitchell's story. Tickets were bought ahead of time. I was looking forward to going to see this Technicolor movie, one of the first. You know what happened? It was bombed before the premiere. They moved the movie, decided they would take it to the Globe Theatre a month later, bombed the first night. Gone with the Wind. They gave up. 4 private clubs, 80 garages and filling stations, 4 hospitals. They were devastated, absolutely devastated, and nursing homes, and 5 schools. Many of us had our educations completely fractured because our schools were bombed. Therefore, where do you go? I went to my grandparents' home, little village school, reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history, physical education, and then you went home to milk the cows, literally. And I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. The school I went to, I did French and Latin and 8 other subjects and a very strict regimen. And so, but I was just there for 8 months until our house was built up enough that I could go back. But those, they said here that 2,500 high explosive bombs, one of the worst situations they had with the bombing was the fact that they used landmines, and they incorporated them into boxes like this, and they dropped them by parachute. And they wouldn't just take out 2 houses, they would take out a block. And in England, in the older areas, the houses were joined together very much like the condominiums are today. And so if you dropped one of those, we went down to the shelter the night of the Blitz, and we came out, this acrid smell of the burning and the broken glass all up and down the sidewalk. I got to the corner of our street getting out of the shelter and looked, and one whole block was gone, completely gone. There were 9 houses all together, and there was hardly any rubble. I mean, normally you'd think you would see the after effect of the bomb damage, but there was barely anything there at all neighbors. And so we read on the posters that they had prepared 500 body areas in 3 mortuaries. They figured that would take care of it. Obviously it didn't. We were into the thousands. A quarter mile from where my house was a road called London Road with many, many grassy areas. And so they sent crews there, and they dug down massive burials, and that's what they started to do 2 days after the Blitz, of the first Blitz, and that was just incredible. And I think they said I know personally about 6 families who have no idea where their parents were, what happened to them. They buried bodies and body parts. They could not identify hundreds and hundreds of people. And so, as you'll see in the footage, which will explain it far better than I could ever tell you, what it was like to pass by that area. People came out by the hundreds and laid flowers, thinking that maybe their family members were in those mass graves. And there is a wonderful memorial there now on London Road. But that was, every time you came out of the house, you passed that area, and it reminded you, you know, just what terrible damage there had been. So I think to have survived all of that, I think, is such an amazing thing. And the fact that there was such a reconciliation process afterwards is very precious to me, and I've been very involved with the rebuilding of the cathedral and the foundation that was established after. I still get regular communications from the new cathedral. I should tell you that I became a legal student in my teens, late teens, and the solicitors firm that I was with, they're attorneys. In England they call folicitors. When the war was over and the damage, of course, was assessed, a committee was formed, 4 men, 4 of the city elders, highly respected attorneys. And the attorney that I was with, he was chosen. His name was Bernard Masser. So I had an incredible privilege of being able to see some of the designs as they came in for the new cathedral. And very controversial. Some people felt that we shouldn't rebuild because you couldn't begin to interpret what the old cathedral would show to people. It should be left as a memory of the damage that had been done. But other people said we should rebuild. So these 4 men, this Mr. Masser and the other 3, had a worldwide architectural contest to come up with new designs for a new cathedral. They all came to this office, and it took weeks and weeks and weeks for them to go through them. And the 4 men made the decision that this Englishman's design, his name was Basil Spence, his design, it was an all-faith, ecumenical design. No pews, just chairs. And it should be for Jewish, Muslim, Christians, all faiths would be welcome in this cathedral. And so they decided that he was knighted for his effort. But I saw that design when it came through. I thought, no way. I was so in love with that old cathedral. It had meant so much to me in my growing up years. It was so utterly magnificent. So, but his new cathedral is attached to that one. So after you've seen the footage, I would really appreciate it if you would stay for a few minutes longer while I tell you about the progress that was made after that, the devastation you will see, and how important it is for us to think about it, that there is a reconciliation process and we really can forgive. So if we can see the footage, I think you will enjoy that.
How long does this film last, please?
About 50 minutes. Yes. And I,
Must go to the media.
yes. I felt so completely fortunate to be not injured in any way. My family were intact. My mother was fine. We came out of it with lots of spirit. I was blessed with a little mother who was 5'1", as I mentioned, and totally upbeat. Never complained. I remember we came back to the house one day from the shelter, came in, and maybe you don't perhaps realize, but when the bomb goes off, there's an incredible blast. It goes in all directions. We had gone down to the shelter in the middle of dinner. The table in the front room in the bay window was totally glass, of course, all taped up, and bombs had gone off on the street. A couple of houses more had disappeared. We trudged through the glass and all the dust and back to the house. The front door was hanging on one side. Came into the dining room, which we passed on the way to get through to the back. We looked in. Shows the calmness of my mother. We looked inside. The walls were cracked on the right-hand side. The ceiling, the plaster, the chandelier was hanging down. And we looked at the table. Not a cup, not a saucer, not a plate was damaged. The food was still on the table. The blast had gone everywhere else, but the table was intact. And my mother said, "That's good." Took years to damage control. You know, the War Damage Commission was established, and so they started repairing some of the homes because 100,000 people actually left the city after that first blitz. Literally picked up their bags of clothes, whatever they could, got out onto the main roads where cars and trucks picked them up and took them out to the open fields, literally, and then they slept in the open fields for a couple of nights until accommodation could be found for them. But 100,000 people left the city because of the incredible damage. And so we fast forwarded, you know, we get past to the end of the war. I must tell you one little story. This is so precious to me. My mother was a great musician. She was a wonderful pianist. Her tiny hands could barely span an octave, but she'd manage. And she entertained everywhere she went. Everybody came to our house, was singing, and it was wonderful. So she decided she would start a community center program. The US troops, the ones I thanked so heartfully in the beginning, put up the money for us to have a community center in our neighborhood, prefabricated building, and they started a concert group there. My mother was in the center. They had 2 piano accordions. She bought one so that she could go around and play this. She couldn't haul a piano around, obviously. 2 banjos, a guitar, a trumpet, set of drums, and they would use a piano or wherever they were. So they managed to get hold of a very ancient bus, and off they would go. We called her Mrs. Bob Hope. And when I came back from, you know, when the house was livable again, I came back after 8 months, and so I used to travel with them too. She had a women's choir, and 10 voices, all women who worked in the factories in the daytime. one story I cherish too. She decided one of the songs they should sing is Now is the Hour, and she said, we'll all dress as nuns. So we had white sheets around us, and we took bandages and put them around our faces, you know, like the nuns have. The only problem with that is if you tried to sing but you can't hear yourself. So we were singing Now is the Hour. My mother is down in the orchestra pit there, standing room only, 600 people in the hall, and we're all singing off key. And she's going, no, 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 no. So we do this, and and off we go. We sing Now in the Hour. But she literally went round to the camps. She also established one Sunday afternoon a month for open house for Americans. And we had 4 Americans come every 3rd Sunday. We didn't have any food we could give them, just whatever. But they were glad to come, and they hugged my mother, called her ma'am, put me out off a little. They called me Red. I got used to that. They had wonderful smiles. They were so grateful for being there with a family. And my mother said, what wonderful smiles they have. They must have incredible dentists in America. So, but what I wanted to mention about the reconciliation process, in spite of all the terrible destruction, 2 countries so at war with each other, the ending was so incredible. When the new cathedral was built at the consecration, all the German chancellors, ministers, and members of the American and European forces who were involved in the European war came to the consecration of the Coventry Cathedral, and the provost, Reverend Howard, who I knew fairly well in those days until he died, he had a service and called it Father Forgive. And those words were etched into the altar above, as it is now in the new cathedral. When the cathedral was bombed, 2 of the workmen with the bishop went into the ruins while everything was still smoking and burning, and found 2 charred pieces of wood from the beams as they had been in the roof. And he put them together with 3 medieval nails that he found, put them together, made a cross out of them, and he put them where the altar used to be on a pile of rubble, and he called them the Cross of Nails. When we bombed Dresden towards the end of the war, as you know, that was desecrated also. But this Cross of Nails Foundation in Coventry, they recorded every part of the rebuilding of Dresden Cathedral. And when their consecration was established, our Reverend Howard and our ministry went from the Coventry Cathedral, performed the consecration of the Dresden Cathedral. 10,000 people were outside the cathedral, couldn't get in. They each carried a white rose, a peace rose, and it was the most incredible experience. The Reverend Schugraff, who was assistant to Reverend Howard, wrote to me afterwards. That was just a few years ago, and he said that was to him the forgiveness part, where they each forgave each other. And I really wanted you to hear that, because when you see the damage and you hear my experience, it leaves you with a very, very sad feeling. But the internationality has come around to this day. Just a few years ago, at the 50th consecration memoriam of our cathedral was held, and the German Chancellor came over for that. So I think we've achieved great things. You as veterans, you people from Coventry also. So thank you all for listening. It's been very, very nice to share these memories with you. So good luck to you all.